Okay, I think we're there.
Right. Okay. Great. I mean, the message I got was about something about live streaming.
Yeah.
What? That's it. Is it? Okay. Good. Yeah. So I thought I'd divide this into 3 bits, and I think the first bit is actually the most I know, interesting or controversial bit, and I'd really be interested in your opinions. So I don't really quite know how you work, but I'm happy to be interrupted and hopefully not shot down as we go through, or to be taken back to things at the end. Do you see what I mean? So I don't know how as I say, I don't know how the group works, but it's really up to you. So the first bit I wanted to talk about was growing up with a disabled father. The second bit was talking about the part that being Jewish has played in my life, and the third bit is talking about my work, and in particular the area of work when I was working in the parenting education field. Okay, so that's the sort of the outline, and so the disabled father bit. So this is the first time I've ever talked about this with a Jewish audience. So I'm really interested to hear your kind of your responses to that. Particularly interested. So my mum, I had a piece in Kahila, I can't remember how long ago now, maybe about a year or so ago, telling my Jewish story, which was about my mum being from Hamburg and being a refugee from Nazi Germany and coming over here when she was 20, and her siblings and her parents escaped as well. She had a couple of relatives in the camps, one of whom was murdered in Auschwitz, one of whom survived. And I don't really want to say any more about that, other than perhaps I did. I mean, when I was growing up, I didn't know about that. I mean, my mum didn't talk about it, and I'm sure that you can, either relate to that through personal experience or through, hearing from other Jewish families. But certainly, it was the dominant story of my childhood, if not. So it wasn't talked about, and I wouldn't have recognized it at the time. And there were certain things that I think as a child I didn't understand, but now looking back on it, I see it as being as being key. So I mean, I did see the edges of it, and again, you can probably understand it. You may remember there was the World at War series on television. Those of you who were in England in the 70s, I think, or maybe it was the 60s or 70s. I think it was the World at War, and there were scenes of the liberations of the camps, and my mum used to run out of the room, and she cried, and I there were signs that she was upset. But my brother and I, so there were 2 of us, we didn't know why she was why she was upset. And the other story of my childhood that also wasn't talked about, and I would say is as important, if not more important, story of my childhood, is that my father was disabled, and I didn't know that my father was disabled. So I mean, I have memories of sort of as a young child. So he had a condition called ataxia, which affects your balance and your speech, and is often genetic. And actually, I've inherited it. I mean, I've got it incredibly mildly, so you probably wouldn't know that I've got it. But if you met my brother, you'd know that there was something wrong with him. But I didn't know that my dad was disabled. I see Lorna's just trying to come in. Will you let her in, Patricia? So as a young child, I mean, I have a memory of playing football with my dad and him sitting in a chair and sort of passing the ball back to me with a stick and sometimes kicking it. And you don't really kind of think anything about that at the time because that's just the way things are. And I have another memory of Peter and me, and I'm a bit older then, and I think I'm about 10ish. I don't know how old I am. and we were on holiday, and my dad is walking down this, I don't know if he's walking down a hill or a mountain, and he's zigzagging because he couldn't, he couldn't walk straight. And we're laughing, and my mum tells us off. And so we know we're not supposed to laugh, and we know that we've done something wrong, but we don't know what it is. And so, I think I was, there were all sorts of stories and things that I interpreted about my dad were to do, which I at the time thought of to do with him being Jewish, but I actually think on reflection that it's to do with him being disabled. So although the Jewish refugee story was the kind of the dominant unspoken story at the time, there was another unspoken story going on at the time, and I recognized that in the 50s, there was an attitude about not talking about things and not talking about disability and illness and death and all that kind of stuff, the kind of ideas of protecting children. I have different views on that, as probably many people here do have. But I also wonder if it was just too much for a family to have both a Jewish refugee and a disability story within. Do you see what I mean? It just couldn't cope with both, and so we had to have one story got sort of completely squashed, and the other story was acknowledged in an unacknowledged kind of way. I mean, in an unspoken sort of way. Yeah. So that's the first bit of my thing about having a disabled father. And as I say, I'd be really interested in your thoughts about that. The second bit of the thing that I would like to talk about is about the part being Jewish played in my life. Yeah, so you've heard a bit about so my mum's background. I grew up in Putney, actually, so obviously not far away. My mum, probably like lot of German Jews, was from an assimilated family, and would have, if it hadn't been for the Nazis, she would have stayed in Germany, had an artistic education, and had a very different life. But of course, that didn't happen. My dad, whose family had been here for a few generations, his mother was in the founding group of liberal Judaism, and so he always felt very connected to liberal Judaism. And so, although we lived in Putney, and I guess Wimbledon Synagogue would have been our nearest progressive synagogue, we always belonged to the main liberal Jewish synagogue, which was in St. John's Wood. And so I had this funny sort of childhood where we lit candles on a Friday night. We did the blessings, which we did in English. Liberal Judaism was very kind of, Hebrew was quite minimalistic then. And we had a family gathering with the wider family at Pesach, and we used to celebrate Hanukkah. And I went to synagogue, miles away, twice a year, and found it really boring. And so I was quite pleased, and we were grown up. We kind of learned that being Jewish was having a religion, and so it was kind of nice when my brother decided he didn't believe in God. So then I followed. He's my older brother, so I then decided I didn't believe in God, and so that was it. So it wasn't Jewish, or being Jewish wasn't important. Okay, so that kind of resolved, I thought, that whole story. But it didn't, because at the point at which I started reflecting on things, I suppose in my late teens and early 20s, clearly being Jewish had a big effect on our family. so it was both a reflection and me getting involved in all kinds of Jewish things. And then I went to Israel initially. I mean, I said to myself and to my friends that it was to study, or it was to experience, not to study, to experience kibbutz living, communal living. So it was kind of a non-Jewish thing that drew me to Israel. But I mean, I had a whole load of experiences in Israel that were quite, I guess, quite influential for me. One of which was that Leah and I met on kibbutz, and so although it wasn't till some years later, but Leah and we married. But so going back to my Jewish story. So the other thing that happened was that the more I got involved in Jewish things and the more I started to bring back Jewish friends to my home, the more my mum sort of opened up about being Jewish and her life in Germany, and I learned a lot more about that. So I mean, that both helped. That really started to explain things a lot for me. I mean, I still wasn't thinking about disability, and I don't know if I said earlier that I don't think it was really until my 50s that I started to see the disability thing as an important issue from my childhood. But yeah, so my mum was talking more. I was learning more about what she'd been through. Okay, so I've mentioned about getting married to Leah, which probably happened at some point there. And one of the things I'd learned was that sharing being Jewish with a non-Jewish community was something that would interrupt that kind of historical isolation that Jews had experienced. And I thought that was key to doing things differently. And so as a parent in my children's primary school, and we were the only Jewish family, I used to go in and do assemblies around Jewish festivals. And I also played guitar, so I went in and did sessions singing with the kids when they were in nursery and as they went up to the primary school, but also went in the class and did Jewish things in the class. I remember one time we cooked, rather unsuccessfully, we cooked matzah. But it was fun, although maybe it didn't taste very nice at the end. I think there was at one point, there was a family who I also knew through Wimbledon Synagogue who joined our school for a couple of years, but essentially it was me. And I remember, so for those of you who've got children, you'll have experienced the kind of the nativity in December, and the whole school sort of becomes Christmas focused pretty much for all of December, and then they finish up with the nativity. Well, in the school where my children went, there was one class that wrote their own Hanukkah play and performed their own Hanukkah play, and so you had this thing, you had the nativity, and you had a story about the Maccabees. The Maccabees and the Romans. I mean, it was so interesting, and I really felt like the primary school that the kids went to was my Jewish home. I mean, another thing we did. So we used to do share Hanukkah with our street. So people, other members of the street would, invite people around for Christmas drinks, and we'd invite people around for a Hanukkah thing, and we kind of light candles and sing songs and eat. Well, we always had loads of food, so it wasn't just latkes, and that's been really nice, because in these last sort of COVID years, Patricia, I see Ed's just wants to come in. Ed or Spiv. Yeah, so in these COVID years, we the street, as well as, so I live in a street that parties whenever it can, basically. And I've also, fortunately, I've got some musicians in the street as well, singers and music and instrument players. And so we do lots of concerts and sing-alongs and stuff. And we've done that. That's kept us going through COVID. And so there was going to be a Christmas Eve get together, and we also had a Hanukkah. The street organised a Hanukkah do, and I think that's really nice. I mean, we ended up we did cook the latkes, but it's lovely to have a bunch of people, come along to a party that you haven't kind of organised for your Jewish festival. So that was it, and then just to say a couple of things about being Jewish and work is that I used to work for the Spyro Institute. And I don't know, do you know the Spyro? Do you know the Spyro Institute? Yeah, so the Spyro Institute, I mean, I think of it as the first organization within the Jewish community that did kind of activities that help connect people with their Jewish roots. I mean, the Spyro Institute, I think, was formed around the time when Roots went out on TV. I don't know if you remember that program about a guy, yeah, Kunta Kinte, who starts in Africa, who's in Africa and then is enslaved, and so on. There's a whole story. Anyway, so there's a whole Jewish roots journey, and I think Spyro was very instrumental in getting that going. And I both went on that journey, and I studied modern Jewish history with them, and then got a job with them, mainly administration. I did a bit of teaching of modern Jewish history in a couple of schools, and actually Rabbi Tony was working there at some point, and that's where I first crossed paths with him. And also, again, limud. I went to the early limuds. I think I went to the first 7 limuds actually, Jewish education conferences, and the last one I went to in that batch was we just had our first child, Sarah, and it was a completely different experience. It had been a wonderful experience when childless, staying up and chatting with people till the early hours of the morning. And of course, when you've got a young child, you just haven't got the energy for that. So that kind of put an end to that from our point of view. Okay, so, and then the third thing I want to talk about a bit is my work. So I've talked about Spyro, which has kind of led into the work. After Spyro, I went and worked with a parenting education organization called Parent Network. And some of you may have heard of Parent Network and the main program that they ran called Parent Link. And that was a really exciting time to be involved in parenting education, because a lot of the things that we take for granted around parenting were kind of new and radical at the time. So we might think about that there are all kinds of things that you can learn as a parent. We might take that for granted. And back in the 80s, it wasn't taken for granted, and we were kind of radical, and nobody was interested in that kind of message and the idea that parents are the greatest influence on their children was a radical thing as well. And so there were a couple of organizations. There was us, and there was another organization that were doing this kind of work, and it was kind of like I think ahead of the game in a way. I mean, basically, the theory behind the organization, the Parent Network, was that people had grown up in not in the nuclear family, but in wider families, and so that as a child you grew up and you looked after your younger siblings or cousins or whatever, and you had lots of experience of children of different ages. As you grew up, you parented, if you want to use that word, these younger children. And then as families became more mobile, families moved away, and that kind of, that part of it, experience of being with younger children was lost. And I remember it particularly in, I felt it was expressed very starkly in one of the groups that I ran, and a mum said, a mum said, reflecting back, when she was a new mother, the first baby she'd ever held was her own. And I thought that, her saying that really typified this sort of change. But I don't, so the program that I ran was called Parent Link, and the idea was linking parents together in a new kind of family. And the organization had great ideas about how we were going to, conquer the world, link all these parents together, and we have spreadsheets of how it was going to happen. It didn't happen. And along with a bunch of other people, I got made redundant because, they had ideas, but they ran out of money. And so for the next while, I became a freelance sort of parenting expert. And I did a bit of work training professionals around working with parents, but most of my work was as a journalist, a freelance journalist. And it was kind of interesting. So you run a parents group, which had maybe at most about a dozen people, because a group doesn't work if you have much more than that. And then I consider sort of the high point of my my freelance journalism was that I used to write a column for Woman's Realm magazine. Now, some of you might remember Woman's Realm magazine. It was a weekly, rather lowbrow women's magazine. And actually, at the time when I started writing for them, I approached them obviously at just the right time, because they were having a revamp of the magazine. And they weren't sure at the time whether they could have a parenting column written by a man. And so my signature, when I write Tim, the M sort of tails away, and it looks a little bit like Tina. Can you imagine that? So I almost became Tina, but then they decided to run photos at the head of all their new columns. And I think it would be a step too much having a Tina looking like me. So I remained Tim, and I became a male parenting guru. Anyway, they stopped my column after, I can't remember, 3 or 4 years. I think I used to write there used to be something in every 2 or 3 weeks. It was a really good journalistic training. Anyway, they stopped my column, and then I'm not sure how many years after, but Woman's Realm folded. And so the story I like to tell is that the reason Woman's Realm folded was because they didn't have my column anymore. But I don't know if anybody read my column. I think they used to say that Woman's Realm was read by 600,000 people. So I like to think that a large number of people read my column, but it might have been zilch. Who knows? Anyway, so after that, doing the parents' work was my sort of spiritual home. And after a little dalliance with teaching, I was taught in a school for about 3 years. I got a job with, the organization was then called the Preschool Learning Alliance. It's now called the Early Years Alliance. And I was working on doing intergenerational learning, so involving preschool kids and parents or grandparents with them. Yeah, that was the work I was doing with them. And probably because I was the only male, but I also happened to have an interest in stuff with men and fathers. I got involved in a lot of projects around increasing the number of fathers involved in what was a very female environment. Yeah, if you went into well, they were called preschools. Back in my day, they were called playgroups, and that they might have been playgroups for those of you that have kids. anyway, they were very female places. I mean, everyone who worked in them was women, and it was always mum who dropped off the kids. And it was, if dad dropped off the kids, he didn't come over the doorstep. And it was a real challenge to get men involved. So anyway, I was involved in lots of really interesting projects. I thought they were really interesting around trying to get more dads involved. And I've just realised I completely forgot to say, and I'll just add it in, that when I worked at Parent Network, something like 90% of the people who came on groups were mums. And so we had a project which I ran around trying to get more fathers into groups and to think about that. Okay, and then the financial crash came along. So it was 2003, I think I started at Parent Network. Crash was, I think, 2008. And I'm not sure at what point I got made redundant, 2010 or 11 or something like that, because money was just pulled away from a lot of what I would say was interesting work in the charity sector generally. I mean, not just in the early years. So I then sort of fell into tutoring, so using my teaching skills and doing tutoring, and I did a lot of tutoring, and then COVID came along, and that reduced a lot, and I pretty much finished that, and then now enjoying the fruits of retirement, when one can have one's finger in a lot of pies voluntarily, and so I do bits and pieces of different things like editing Kahila and a few other things. And that's where I'll leave it. So thanks very much for listening, and over to you guys to comment or question. So Patricia, do you organise this? Do you bring people in? You're still on mute.
I'm not on mute, so I'll just say thank you. That was really fascinating. And I'm interested, you said you never knew your father was disabled. Is that because nobody ever talked about it, or you just didn't notice the things that were different about him compared to other people?
I think, I mean, I don't think I noticed. I just didn't. That's the way Daddy was.
Yeah. Did his illness get worse over time?
Yeah. So ataxia is, well, many forms of ataxia are progressive, and so when I was young, he was still walking, although zigzagging. His speech was fine, as far as I remember. That became more slurred and more difficult to understand him as I got older. I don't really remember the timescale. His handwriting, which was always difficult to read, because that's a typical symptom of ataxia. I suppose his fine motor control got worse. So his handwriting was impossible. And it really wasn't until I was in my 50s that I started to think of him as a disabled man. And it sounds really weird, and I can see that, and I meant to say this to you, and I forgot, that, an alien from outer space looking at our family would say he's got a disabled father. I mean, that would be the salient feature of the family. But
presumably your father didn't.
I never thought about it.
Was disabled. Otherwise, he would have made a point about it. But maybe he chose to be as able-bodied as he could and didn't want the label.
Maybe. I mean, that maybe. I really don't know. I haven't really. I mean, I've tried to think about it, but I mean, that's very, really interesting. I mean, I remember, he used to tell a story about how when he was a young man and he did this rugby tackle, and I have an image of him flying through the air and, getting somebody, by the legs. I mean, not a completely different image from how he presented himself when he was parenting me. But I think, the way our family dynamic was that we all kind of pussyfooted a bit around my mum, trying to keep her from exploding. And so I tended to see my family as revolving around her. But that's really interesting what you say about, my dad and with attitudes towards disability being so much more negative then as now. You can understand him not wanting to acknowledge his disability.
Any of your friends ask you about your father, that is walking strange or something like this?
I don't remember anything about it. My mum said that as my dad got more disabled, they helped him less, or they kind of dropped them. They didn't offer to help, and I think that was one thing that she felt badly about that the synagogue, St. John's Wood Synagogue, was that they kind of knew how difficult. I can't remember how we got there, if we got a taxi or what, but nobody ever offered to help. That's my mum. That's, I can remember that's what my mum said. Although I can also think of occasions where, I don't think my mum accepted help either.
Tim,
there's the two sides of it. Mm-hmm.
Tim, it sounds like your father was trying to minimize the effect of the disability on his family. From your point of view, how did it affect his life? Did it affect his working, the kind of jobs he did, and so
on? Well, he was a solicitor. I know he had to retire slightly early, so he retired. I think he was in his early 60s, 62, for some reason I remember. I don't know if that's exactly right. I don't think it stopped him from his work. I think he became, my mum was certainly frustrated with him at home, and I think he was probably frustrated about the things that he couldn't do. But I don't remember that being talked about at all.
Yeah.
Tim, when you were at school, there were other children. Did you have any anti-Semitism there?
No, I don't remember anything. I just remember the only story I remember is my brother coming home. So I went to a church for a couple of years. I went to a church primary school. Can you believe it? So Peter comes home from school and says to my mum, "Well, I don't mind if I die because I'll go." Jesus says, "I'll go to heaven," or something like that. I don't know what it was. I don't know what my mum's response was. No, I don't remember any overt anti-Semitism. Any anti-Semitism, actually.
Excuse me, Tim. You mentioned at the outset that some forms of ataxia are genetic. So, and I'm assuming then that's the type of ataxia that is in your family. Did your father, or was there any indication, was that true of a grandparent or something like that? Was anybody else in the family afflicted with it?
Not that we're aware of. You're probably right. But one, it may not have been diagnosed. I mean, they may not have had the information to diagnose it, and also with people dying younger. So the form of ataxia that we have, well, they don't know which gene causes it, but it's what's called a late onset thing. Appears in later life. So you may carry the gene from birth, but there are some forms of ataxia that affect you in child, or the symptoms appear in childhood, but this one doesn't appear till later in life. I mean, for example, they think that I think it's Abraham Lincoln they think might have had ataxia. So I mean that there are stories about people who've had ataxia, but there's a lack of information about whether they actually did or didn't. But that's an interesting question. No, I mean he's the first person, and also of his, there were 4 siblings. So I mean this isn't a session on genetics, and I wouldn't want to run a session on genetics anyway, because I don't know enough. But from the little I've learned, so this form of ataxia is called autosomal dominant. So when you have children, they have a 50-50 chance of getting it. So that my children have a 50-50 chance of having ataxia. And if my daughter has ataxia, I mean, she hasn't had a test, so she doesn't show any symptoms, so she hasn't thought about it. If she's got ataxia, her children have a 50-50 chance of also having ataxia. But if she doesn't have ataxia, then they won't.
Okay.
Is there any treatment for it now, Tim?
There's no cure as yet, and there are therapies such as a neurophysiotherapy or speech therapy. There are things that you can do to minimize the symptoms, I suppose.
Just getting back to you, Tim. What do you think, this rather strange childhood as you've described it, I mean, what do you think the long-lasting effect has been on you in terms of your life? Because it sounds like at the time you weren't aware that so much was being covered up. And I don't know when that started dawning on you and when the interest in parenting and so on kicked in. How old were you when that first occurred?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think my childhood had a huge effect on me and has probably determined very much of the rest of my life. I'm sure that one of the reasons for wanting to work in the Jewish community, working for Spyro, was wanting to understand a bit more about what happened to me when I was young, and working for a parenting organization and running groups for parents. I really wanted to tell these, the things I wanted to say to these parents were the things I wanted to say to my parents. And I had learned enough not to tell them off. I mean, that's what I think I wanted to have a go at my parents. So I learned not to do that to the parents of my groups. I mean, I think I ran very good groups.
So how old are you when that first interest developed?
So the parenting groups. So I was born in '53, and just to say, I think '50s parenting. And again, I don't know how true of this is for any of you, but I think of '50s parenting as being the parenting of secrets, and I think of it as the parenting of, if you've got a garden and a baby, you put the baby at the bottom of the garden, and when they're lying there screaming and waving their hands and feet, you're thinking to yourself, they're happy, they're gurgling and doing this, because you can't hear them screaming. So I don't think the way I was brought up was particularly out of step with the kind of parenting that was happening at the time. but yeah, I started working for the Parent Network. I got involved with the Parent Network in '86, so I'd have been 33.
Mhm.
I think. Yeah, so I've been a parent for a couple of years.
Okay. Mhm.
Tim.
Yeah.
Tim.
Ask.
Oh yeah, if you can hear me, yeah, fine. Do you think that parenting skills for fathers should be, in a way, made compulsory? Because my parenting skills were totally non-existent. Nobody ever taught me anything. Nobody ever suggested I should go to any form of parenting, and I would probably have rejected it anyway. But looking back, I realized how bad I was at bringing up my children, in point of fact. Although fortunately, they both turned out extremely well.
We all find that difficult to believe.
Well, don't seem to resent too much of my aberrations. But I think looking speaking as a grandfather, and after having seen the other generation grow up and the way my daughter and son-in-law brought their children up, I feel that I was really lacking in tolerance terribly.
That's a really interesting comment and question. Yeah, I think my dad was supposedly a good father because he could boil an egg. You know, I mean, I think standards have changed hugely since then. And rather than trying to answer your question about whether there should be parenting skills for dads, I'm gonna sort of answer it with a completely different comment, where you may know that you know, after children are born, parents parental leave is now something that's available to parents, and I can't remember what the take-up of men using parental leave is, but it's incredibly small. And in a few countries, and I think I can't remember, the Nordic countries are some of those, there's a daddy month, and it's kind of use it or lose it. So that rather than the couple, you know, if they're two parents together, choose out how they divide the time, there is time that's specifically for dads to use or not, and the take up of the time by these dads has been huge. And I do think the experience of the hands-on experience of being a father, of parenting, hugely impacts on you. And I don't quite know the best way of getting that message out, but certainly, you know, I mean, there's huge changes. I mean, my uncle, I think it's my uncle, when his child was born, I can't remember if he said to his employer, "Can I come in late or can I go off early?" or something like that, and his employer said no. When Sarah was born, I was working at Spyro. I actually asked for, I think, a day and a half off, and you know, that was considered to be very demanding. I mean, I did get it in the end, but they had to. I don't know how they decided to. When my daughters, when Mabel was born, my granddaughter, yeah. I can't quite remember how much time Matt got off. I think he didn't work for about, the dad, he didn't work for about 6 months, and then he was able to work part-time, I think 3 days a week for the rest of the year. So to me, you know, I mean, okay, there are particular reasons why he could take so much time off, but there is huge generational change, and I'm not I haven't kept up on that in that field, so I don't know what, I don't know where things are going, but certainly
my son's friend had 6 months off paternity leave, and my son, who's just had his wife's just had a baby, he's got 2 weeks, but he's managed to negotiate another 4 weeks at different times, paternity leave. And I know that my daughter-in-law's firm actually have a room where mothers can express milk. So that's very forward thinking.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I mean, I don't know enough, but I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, because I think that's that certainly shows the direction that we're moving in. And I mean, the story I know I used to tell when I was working in the parenting field was about, dads who, very much like David was saying, with their first families, were very much in the background and didn't have so much hands-on with their kids. But if they separated and had and then had a new partner and new children, they generally, or very often, wanted to, felt they'd missed out and wanted to be more involved.
Yeah. Tim, I think also there should be grandparenting skills. Nobody teaches you how to be a grandparent.
Yeah. We actually, you're absolutely right, Paula. And thinking you know best, or letting your son or daughter learn through their own mistakes is probably somewhere near the top of handling that. I mean, issues that I used to think about, and particularly after I'd run the Fathers Project, was that when you're running a parenting group, you might have a group of, say you've got 12 people and 10 of them are mums and a couple of dads. You've actually got, you might have 20 parents. Okay, so there may be there's only 12 of them in the room with you, but you're thinking about whole family, whole family, not just being parents of their children, but also having partners, and how, because I think parenting, is also negotiating the relationship with your partner about how you do things with the children, and which gets really kind of interesting when you disagree about approaches. And I'm not quite sure what that face that you're making, Judy, tells us, but it says something. I used to love, my favorite groups that I loved running were sibling rivalry groups. So what we did was we had the parent link, which was the kind of like the program, the basic program, and then we had part ones in a way, and then we had part twos for people who'd done parent link and learnt the skills, and part twos were programs on which had a particular focus, and one of those was sibling rivalry, and it was a 2-session program, and I used to love running that because I thought that was really, really interesting. And we used to do things with our kids. It's like, the example I remember is, sorry, you're getting a bit of parenting education now, whether you want to or not. So if I know, so they want to watch the telly, and one of them wants to watch one program, and the other one wants to watch another program, and the kind of approach that we would Parent Network would promote is that rather than coming in as a policeman and making a decision for them, you kind of let them decide for themselves. So you might say something like, that's a big problem. How are you going to sort that one out? And this is in the days of, I think video recorders might have existed. I'm not quite I can't remember quite where technology was at in those days, but it was kind of interesting. You know, they come up with a solution and they'd be really happy with they come up with a solution, even though you were thinking, God, that's a pretty rubbish solution. You know, only one of you getting satisfied or whatever. But you know, the principle of them learning that they were problem solvers, even though was more important than whatever they did. So it was kind of interesting, I thought.
Tim, there is a psychologist whose name I've forgotten, and he wrote a seminal book about when you were dealing with children. I'm sorry?
I said Bruno Bettelheim, but you meant
no,
you may not have mentioned
him. But he always said, put the ball in the child's court. You know, if they have an issue, let them try to solve it instead of you solving it for them. And that's really what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I don't know whether you're talking about a guy called Chaim Guinot.
Yes, I am.
He was the kind of the guru in a way, I would say, to, well, I mean, there were a lot of influences on the kind of parenting work that we did, and so Chaim, this guy Chaim Guinot, he used to run groups, and he had a couple of people, Elaine Faber and I can't think of the first name, Maslish, Faber and Maslish, who attended his groups, and they wrote some fabulous books. And if you don't know them, Pauline, I can dig out the names of their books, and you might, if you're still interested in this kind of stuff. I mean, one of their books was Liberated Parents, Liberated Children. And I remember I gave that to my daughter not so long ago, just because I think, you know, it'll really help her. I mean, it really helped me think about parenting things. Issues.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm sorry I have to go, but I really enjoyed it. I've really, really enjoyed your talk. I have.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Oh, I'm
Thank
glad
you,
did.
Tim.
Tim, it was very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next project, Tim, has got to be grandparenthood.
Absolutely. Okay, Tim, thank you very much for talking. It was great.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Well,
really
thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
And I'd be really, really interested in more comments and thoughts about particularly about the disability thing, because that's something that I sort of haven't really quite come to terms with, and I was sort of trying out with you a bit.
Okay.
Thanks, Tim. Lovely to go all those years ago, Caroline Penny. That's
right, Caroline, yeah.
I worked with at Merton College many years ago, which are talking about grandparenting, and I'm afraid you are in my bedroom. I'm living in a 1-bedroom annex at the moment because we have crossed the river to north of the river to be near our grandchildren.
Oh.
So this is real. It's really apparent when you talk about grandparenting skills. I know nothing, absolutely nothing.
Well, I just happen to have on the near where I'm sitting this. So when we used to run this program, and there were 12 sessions in the program that was called Parent Link, yeah. And it used to be little booklets that we gave out. And Lorna was just saying that she worked in Merton College, and I remember there was somebody in Merton College who also used to run this parenting program. And I remember, okay, so we need to talk about grandparenting really, but I gave my daughter a couple of booklets because I thought there was some stuff in there that she might find helpful. But anyway.
Really, I'm going to have to run because I've got to go on the school run later on. But lovely to see everybody.
Thank you.
It's lovely.
Thanks, Tim. Lovely to see you.
Bye.
So much.
Thanks very much for listening.
Okay.
Thank you.
Contributing. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Really interesting.